Hey guys, coL.qxc here. Today I'm going to be talking about mobility. We're going to be talking about basically how do you get the most value out of your really fast units, those units that you can move around the map very quickly. And in order to do so, we're going to be taking a look at a TVZ, and we're going to look at actually how the Zerg is using his army. And hopefully that'll give you some insight into how better to use your own army. This concept of mobility applies whether it's Mutalisks, Phoenixes, Phoenixi, Phonics, Medivacs, Hellions, Marines, whatever. As long as you're faster in terms of movement speed than the army that you're dealing with, this should be applicable. And I think there's no better matchup here than the Zerg side of Zerg versus Terran in order to get a better look at how that actually works. So without further ado, let's just jump right into this game. There we are. Alright, so this is from the Intel Extreme Masters, Shenzhen, in the grand finals of Liquid Tasia versus Samsung something or another Solar. And basically I'm going to be highlighting some of the ways that Solar uses his army in order to get the most amount of effectiveness out of it. And a lot of that has to do with exploiting the fact that the Zerg army is just faster than the Terran ground army. And so we're going to kind of be walking through some number of minutes here and going from there. And this pack of Mutalisks is going to be kind of the focus right now. Is essentially what he's doing, and a big part of this has to do with this is a more micro-intensive situation for the Terran player than it is for the Zerg. There's simply no way around it, because if both players had zero control at all, the Zerg player would win every single time, because you got to split and micro and manage Banelings much more than the Zerg player has to prevent the Banelings from doing dumb things, especially at this phase in the game. If Tasia had a whole bunch of Thors, then perhaps it'd be a little differently, but right now, you just want the Banelings to connect. The Terran player's got to do a whole bunch of stuff. So, what he's doing with his Mutalisks here is increasing the amount of units that the Terran player has to keep at home, or suffer great losses, whatever. And this kind of works because there's enough creep out here that Tasia can't just take this army and A-move at the hatchery, or at least sit off creep and attack the hatchery. And what's going to end up happening here is the amount of supply that these Mutalisks are going to force home is going to be hopefully at least equal to the amount of supply that they're worth. So right now there's 14 Marines at home, and this is, 11 Mutalisks. So there's not quite as much supply committed at home as the Mutalisks are, but that's pretty much to be expected. Marines are more cost efficient than Mutalisks. You should never need as much supply to deal with that. Sometimes players will overcommit. Now the really good thing that you can do, and this is a generic thing that can happen. This is a function of having units that are more mobile than your opponents. Is these Marines are on the defensive. These Mutalisks can regroup and join this fight before these Marines have an opportunity to get there. So basically what the Zerg player can do, and what you can do whenever you've got units that are faster than your opponents, is threaten an area that's far away from the combat. And whether it's right here, or even to some extent this area, that's fine. Force units to appear in that place and defend, and then it basically becomes a race between those two sets of units to get back to the main battle. And if you're more mobile than your opponent, then you should always win that race. Mutalisks are always going to get back to the fight sooner than Marines. The Terran player can kind of keep up with, like let's say you had two Medivacs here. As soon as you see the Mutas start running towards this army, he picks up those Marines and boosts the Medivacs. And if the fight's not too far away, like in this case, it's only about a screen and a half, that would work. On a bigger map like Deadwing, where the combat is more on the other side of the map, then that wouldn't really apply. Okay, we're gonna fast forward a little bit here. Want to get to some of the points where Solar starts doing more backstabs and additional Mutalisk play. He's very good at recognizing that the Mutalisk are not particularly strong on the defensive. They don't really hold a head-on fight with the Marines, and while they can snipe the Marauders out, you're not really going to take control of the game if you're just playing defensively with your Mutalisk, I guess is the point. And one thing to note here is this pack of Marines is still totally missing from this engagement. And this is going back to kind of what I was saying, was where you can use your more mobile units to force the battles to happen on your opponent's side of the map, and then regroup and have a fight happen on your side of the map, where your more mobile units are able to be at that part faster than your opponents. And here we go. This is kind of round 2 of the Mutalisk harass. As you can see, they're coming in. There's enough stuff here to deflect this, but he's taken out 2 turrets, and that's going to perhaps prompt either additional turrets or more Marines being left behind. And this is, again, what Tasia really wants. He doesn't actually want these Marines to be here. He wants them to be as close to the battle as possible, if there's going to be a large engagement, which is pretty likely because the creep spread is starting to be diminished. And we're going to fast forward a little bit more here. We don't see it as much at this point in the game, and that's largely in part because of the position that Tasia has. It makes it very hard for Solar to do run-bys at this third. As long as Tasia controls this area, it's very hard for Solar to go up or up this way. Okay, so a little bit of Mutalisk poke here, again, forcing those units to come home. And you can see here, this is kind of what I was talking about before. A more explicit example is some of the Marines have been committed at home, although not very many, because the Mutalisk count had diverted. But then he's able to bring these Mutalisks to bear on the army. Obviously, they don't do a great deal in this specific situation, but the idea is still valid. Fast forward a little bit more. So, as the player with the more mobile army, or if you have components of your army that are more mobile than your opponents, you always want to be looking for ways to create conflict unopposed, basically. And where unopposed does not mean your opponent has no army there. It means that the force you bring to bear is much, much larger than the force that your opponent has. So, for example, the assumption that Solar's making blindly, which is a pretty decent one, is that this is a depot wall and a bunker, and maybe a Widow Mine, but perhaps not. This is more than enough to break down the depot wall, break down the bunker, and then basically force units to be rallied to that position. And that will then open up further opportunities here where some supply is diverted, and then that gives Solar some opportunities to have an engagement up front where Tasia doesn't have the same amount of supply that he would want to. And again, you can see just always... So there's kind of 2 things here. I've been focusing mostly on making the engagements happen on your opponent's side of the map. The other very important one is not taking engagements unnecessarily. This whole time, there's been very little actual fighting. There's been poking, there's been a little bit of back and forth, but the 2 players have never traded armies in a head-on engagement. And that has to do with Tasia's a good enough player to know that he doesn't want to just walk on a creep and take that fight. And Solar's a good enough player that he knows he doesn't want to go off of creep and take that fight. So it's mostly been about Solar using the mobility of his army to have to force battles to happen where Tasia isn't. And that's what allowed him to get so many SCV kills, force all these turrets at his natural, get a whole bunch of SCV kills here. Now this other base is going down, and this is a great example of then using the superior mobility of your army to bring the fight to bear on your opponent. And so basically what Tasia ends up being forced into is a position where he needs to go defend this base, and he also needs to commit units back at his third. And there's just too many positions for him to defend at the same time, that not only is his attention stretched, but his army is very stretched, and that makes it hard for him to actually put his army in the correct place to make all that happen. So there's kind of one last component to this. I guess the final question is, okay, so your army is more mobile than your opponent's, and you want to have fights happen where you have an overwhelming numerical or strength advantage. That's all great, but how do you actually make that happen? And the basic idea is all about information. It's all about controlling the information that your opponent has and increasing the amount of information you have. And so what I mean by that is you need to have... Oh no, I'm good. Okay. I was terrified that I wasn't actually recording this. You need to have as much information on the map as possible. That means vision as far as around as you can. That tells you where your opponent's army is. The more information you have about your opponent's army's movements and the army positioning back home, the more easily you can make these run-bys where you go straight into a mineral line and there's nothing defending it. That means using changelings. That means strategically positioning overlords in dead space so you can see medevacs. That means spreading as much creep as possible. Obviously, these are all Zergy things. In order to increase that overall vision. The same thing applies with Terran, though. It's mostly just about spreading Marines, though. Spreading Marines and consistent scans. You figure out where your opponent's army is, and then you make a battle happen somewhere else. Or in Terran versus Zerg, you're kind of making it happen where they are, because you generally have the stronger head-on army. And so it's all about get vision of what your opponent's doing, where your opponent is located, and then attack somewhere else. And that's basically the fundamental keys to using a highly mobile army. StarCraft is... balance is perhaps not the right word here, because we've kind of taken this term and convoluted it. We've destroyed it in a lot of ways. But the units in StarCraft are different in that if a unit has high in one stat, it has low in other stats. And that is the basic attempt at balancing the game and making sure that everything kind of interacts nicely. Units in StarCraft that are fast give it up in other areas. They either have lower damage output. In the case of Zerglings, they have very low hit points, very vulnerable to splash damage, other things like that. And so if you've got a really fast unit in StarCraft, it's not going to win the head-on engagement. So being able to learn to use it in a way that's more appropriate will definitely go a long way towards just general StarCraft success in life, success in relationships, in owning pets, having an apartment. Thanks for watching, guys. I'm coL.qxc. This has been Utilizing Mobility. Just made that name up right now. Great, we're going with it. I'll see you guys next time. Later.